Okie pokey weirdos, I'm Rev, and welcome to my world of cosplay shenaniganery. Time to continue with this two-part series, the sword and armor that I initially thought were complete trash when I first finished them, and now looking back, I feel a little bit better about them knowing that they were my very first giant EVA foam project. This video is for the armor, and I will link the vid for the sword up here. Disclaimers. These were my very first nearly fully EVA foam projects, as commissions. I greatly reduced the price of the build due to my lack of knowledge in foam smithing at the time. And it was one of my first 3 commissions, so I was in a state of still working out how I wanted to handle commissions and what I was capable of making for other people. No, I am not available for any EVA foam project commissions of this magnitude as of posting this video for now, because thanks to these 2 projects, I learned a great deal and want time to practice with what I've learned so that I can create much higher quality projects for my customers. Therefore, I am posting my builds of the sword and armor not as tutorials, but in feeling that plenty of people can learn from my mistakes. And also to show that we all have to begin somewhere, so feel free to try something new, because even if it doesn't go perfectly, you might surprise yourself. How the heck did I manage this? Let's take a look at how I made this armor for Rena from Hack. With this project being a commission, it was made for someone who's actually a more average human sized as compared to my tiny hobbit size, so I brought out my trusty adjustable mannequin, Felicia. Just like with most projects, I started by making a paper pattern. The hip guards were something like giant ovals that tapered at the end. The booby cups were circles, later slit down the middle and turned into cones. The hand guards and forearm guards, or vambraces, were layered half ovals, all growing slightly larger than the previous one as they made their way up the arm. The elbow pads were giant orange peels that glued together into half circles. The codpiece was another oddly tapered oval, and I made patterns for all the little diamonds and swirly details. Everything was cut out of high density foam, then heat formed as well as heat sealed. For the heat forming, wear a respirator and have good ventilation. I simply heated up the foam enough that it would curve, and I formed the shapes mostly over and around my knuckles or arm, holding it there until it cooled. Next was contact cement, still wearing a respirator and having good ventilation. I glued together all the pieces that had been cut apart to better help form the shape later in the gluing process. Those pieces being the hip armor having been split down the middle to encourage the center curve, the booby cups curving into shallow cones, and the elbow pads, which had a lot of connecting to do. The elbow pads definitely gave me some trouble, and they kept ripping apart because I wasn't timing the contact cement correctly. Once getting somewhere close to what I wanted, I began super gluing the edges because I was struggling so much with the contact cement by this point. Any gaps were filled in with wood glue, and then I could move on to sealing and painting. For any of you who follow me on the regular, y'all know that I like to combine my base coat of paint with the sealant because I can use whatever acrylic paint color works best for the project, most commonly black or white, to tint my sealant, and the sealant being Cosflex. Normally the mixture is 1/3 acrylic and the rest is the primer. Cosflex is a non-toxic substitute for Plastidip, and it is now my best friend. Not sponsored, but it could be. Once every piece had about 3 coats of white acrylic and Cosflex, as well as the undersides getting a couple coats of black tinted Cosflex, I could move on to the actual painting. I'd gotten a new airbrush, so I was very excited to try it out and see how well it did on these pieces. For the yellow sections, I taped off and added newspaper to all the places where I didn't want the yellow paint to go, and then went crazy with the airbrush. Surprisingly, for the yellow, the airbrush did so very well, and I managed to get the perfect combination of watered down acrylic into the brush bucket and perfectly layered it onto my pieces. First try! But then it was time to struggle with the pink paint. This pigment ended up being very thin, and watering it down to make it go through the airbrush properly meant it came out almost transparent. It was a very frustrating number of days for me trying to figure out if I'd broken my brand new airbrush or if it was just the paint. After working with this pink paint over the course of a number of projects, because I also used it for Ozzy's hat, I simply found that it's a very thin paint. To avoid continuing the airbrush struggles, I moved to hand painting the pink sections. To thicken the paint, I combined it with Mod Podge, which definitely helped. I had hoped to use the airbrush to avoid any brush strokes, but to avoid as many brush strokes as possible with the hand painting, I did paint in layers of repeated X's. Another method I tried to reduce brush strokes was dropping a puddle of paint at the top of the project, then scraping the paint down the length of the project with a long strip of scrap foam. While this method does work, it's not my preference. I much prefer to stick with the painting X's. Eventually, I decided the paint job was still too patchy and it would take much too long to properly layer on as much paint as I needed to make the surface spotless. Therefore, I tried using Cricut Cutter sticker sheets. I miraculously found these sheets that were the proper shade of pink. How? I don't know. Thank you, Dollar Tree. I cut out each shape of every piece based upon the paper patterns from the Cricut Cutter paper, then I could easily stick down that paper onto the foam pieces and not have any brush strokes visible. Hallelujah! I very much enjoyed this method and will have to do it again sometime because avoiding the struggles with paint is much preferred. However, I do need some more practice of properly sticking down these Cricut Cutter paper sheets because some air bubbles, ripples, and puckers did come up because I was in a hurry for this project. So this method could really look amazing if it's done carefully. Next, all of the pink armor needed yellow borders. I cut out thin strips of foam and straight pinned them in place to my pink pieces to measure out and cut the proper shape and length needed. With yellow Cricut Cutter paper, I traced out the shapes and left excess so that the lips hanging off of the edge could be cut into wedges and folded over to the back, allowing the yellow sections to properly curve with the shape of the borders. I found that I had to hot glue these curves because the stickiness of the yellow simply wasn't strong enough on its own. These borders were first hot glued down to the pink sections, then super glued. The yellow detailing, those sort of diamond shapes for all the armor, was stuck down with Cricut Cutter paper as well. These were the pieces I should have worked on a little more carefully because they were the ones that came up with the most puckers. With all of the EVA foam pieces done, I moved on to the one handmade fabric piece for this costume, the loincloth. I cut some pieces of white thrifted bed sheets and gave them a quick dye bath of pink and white acrylic paint watered down to get the right shade of extremely pastel pink. This piece of fabric also had a channel sewn into it so that the belt could loop through this piece, and the cod piece was glued to this fabric. For the little white ball at the top center of the cod piece, I actually took one of the little plastic eyeballs from Dollar Tree, sanded away the paint with my Dremel, then hot glued down the little ball to the foam. For the elbow pad spikes, I used basic kids craft foam so that I would not have to continue fighting with any sticker paper or paint, and I could leave them the color they were originally. I cut out the triangles with rounded bases, then glued the edges together and glued the tall cones to their 3 different placements on each elbow pad. To seal all the EVA foam pieces, I gave them a light dusting of Flex Seal clear coat. This is a clear coat that I really like using, but it is a bit pricey and definitely has a learning curve to it. Spray it too thick and there's bubbles all over your project. Spray it too thin and your project doesn't have a proper sealant coating. But get it just right, and I love watching these EVA foam pieces bounce off the sidewalk and come back without a scratch. Now it is time to see how all these pieces are attached to a human body. For the handguards, I hot glued black felt to the wrist cuffs, then fabric glued yellow sweatbands to that black felt. I used clothespins to clamp the pieces together while drying. Now the handguards can be easily slipped on and off, as well as be pretty comfortably worn because of the fluffy little sweatbands. The elbow pads also got the yellow sweatband treatment. Inside the van braces, I glued sleeves of black spandex. For the hip guards, there were a series of nylon webbing straps. I traced where I knew I wanted the nylon webbing to sit on the armor, then cut out little black felt bases for those attachment sections and hot glued them down. I'm using black felt for all of these pieces because the texture of the sweatband and or the nylon webbing doesn't really agree very well with the sealant or the foam, but felt does. So I could glue down either end of the nylon webbing to either side of the hip armor. Along that webbing are 2 loops that have a belt slip through them, and I did not sew them in place so that they could be adjustable and my client could get them sitting where they wanted them. The final step for the armor, the studs. All studs were googly eyes, which I removed the black discs from so that they wouldn't rattle. Then they were painted yellow and given a clear coat sealant. Each stud was hot glued into their proper place. Wrist cuffs, hip armor, and now we're on to the boots! Okay, not exactly boots, boot covers. The pieces for these consisted of 4 white stretch velvet side pieces, 2 silver stretch velvet sole pieces, multiple long 2-inch thick strips of silver, and 2 long 4-inch thick teal rectangles cut from some thrifted 4-way stretch fabric. And don't forget those googly eyes. The side pieces and soles were stitched together pillowcase or bag lining method, and the teal rectangles were top stitched to the top of the boot covers. For the silver piping and borders, I hot glued a strip of faux leather down the long length of the silver strips to create more structure for these pieces. Then while wearing the boot cover over a shoe to get a proper shape, I hot glued each of those borders and piping pieces down in the correct places. Yes, these were a little bit baggy on me, I was making them for a human, not a hobbit. And the bottom of the boot covers got non-skid, slip-resistant sole protectors. I E6000 glued them on for this part. And they were for the toes and heels to have traction. This was a big safety precaution because the stretch velvet would be very slick if it was the material making contact with the surface. So, no sliding all over the place. We don't want to be falling and cracking our heads open. Grippy safety first. The attachments to the armor to the black top, i.e. sports bra, was Velcro. Each EVA foam piece had a piece of Velcro glued to it with E6000, and a corresponding piece of Velcro was sewn to the sports bra. And Rena does only have a single strap, so I replaced the other strap with a strip of mesh fabric matching my client's flesh tone, so to still have the support of a strap, but without seeing it as easily. For the leggings, I bought them and stitched on the yellow detailing, and that is the armor, plus the few little fabric pieces for Rena. There is Ko-fi and Patreon if you want to follow along with any of the daily builds that I'm working on now. My plan for my next big EVA foam project is a personal project of Ceres from Galaxy Quest, and I will link the videos of my prototyping for this project up here because this is a massive monster of a costume and it's going to take a lot of work and a long time, so I'm doing it in little segments. Especially working on it when the weather is warmer so it's more comfortable to either be in my garage or outside. I love all of my amazing weirdos and would greatly appreciate it if you could help prove to YouTube that there are those of us who still prefer to watch long-form content. So remember those subs, comms, thumbs, and a ding! And welcome to the madness!